Regional banking crisis. Really? That's what you got. A regional banking crisis. Huh. The banks that have failed are all well into the 99th percentile by size, and were all, curiously, the banks of choice for fantastically wealthy people, and yet the media, whose normal stock in trade is shock headlines and clickbait, has dubbed the most twisted financial meltdown ever regional banking crisis. Huh. You know you're being lied to on a colossal scale, right? Yeah, you do. That's why you're here. With me, John Titus, at Best Evidence, away from the tempest of misdirection and irrelevance that is raging outside, where we see financial professionals, alleged financial professionals, swerving to avoid the most obvious questions imaginable, like, is it possible that the Fed's injection of $5 trillion of deposits into a $13 trillion banking system had something to do with this crisis? Why doesn't anyone ask that? And why aren't they showing you telltale signs of banks that are in trouble? Are they just shilling for big banks, or are they genuinely simply just ignorant? At the end, I guess it really doesn't matter. What does matter is what's actually going on and what you can do about it. And to that end, I am going to explain how the Federal Reserve caused the crisis and why. Now, I'll openly admit that the why entails some speculation on my part. The how, by contrast, does not, because the record is so irrefutably clear on causation. The Fed caused this crisis, period, full stop. And after I lay that out, I'm going to give you 2 red flag tests that you can use to check your bank on publicly available websites for signs of trouble and signs of distress, like the banks that went down. But to set the table for this, to date, 3 banks have failed: Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic. And they failed like all banks fail. A solvency crisis turned into a liquidity crisis. And since there's some confusion over that distinction, let me talk about that briefly. A solvency crisis really is a spreadsheet problem. The cells in the asset column add up to less than the cells in the liability column. And it's really just sort of a paper, almost an academic problem. Most banks deal with the solvency problem simply by pretending that the asset cells are bigger than they are. They pad the asset values. And that works for a while. It works until enough creditors want to get paid and the bank can't convert pretend asset valuations into real cash. And then some of the creditors start to stare at the bank officer's knees, and maybe they pull out a 2-iron or a piece of rebar. That is a liquidity problem. That is no longer a paper problem when they're going to break your legs. And that is when the banks get shut down, at least in theory, by the regulators. But banks, make no mistake about it, can float in a state of insolvency for years without the plug ever getting pulled. I largely covered the solvency problem in the last episode when I told you there was a banking crisis 3 weeks and 2 days before it actually showed up on the doorstep of Silicon Valley Bank when it failed. And I explained how the Fed drove that problem or exacerbated that problem by raising interest rates. There is now widespread agreement on the solvency problem, with countless bank analysts telling you after the crisis started what this channel told you beforehand. Now, though, in this episode, we want to go deeper into the liquidity crisis and talk about that. In the last video, I pointed to evidence that there was a liquidity crisis. Specifically, there was evidence of it manifesting itself in the form of panic borrowing from the Federal Home Loan Board banks, the FHLB. But I really left it at that. I said, look, when those things spike up, FHLB borrowing goes up, it's a sign of a crisis. The crisis is here. It's crisis now. Today, though, in this episode, I want to pick up where I left off and go into granular detail about the liquidity problem. But before I do that, let's take a look at a basic bank balance sheet visually and talk about liquidity, since it does seem to be such a source of confusion. So let's just cut over to the Jolly Jester Bank a familiar character on this channel. As you will recall, it is headquartered in Modesto, California. That is about 90 miles to the east of Silicon Valley Bank in Santa Clara. The Jolly Jester Bank is just like all banks. It's got assets and liabilities. So we'll have assets on the left and liabilities on the right. Its assets out there in Modesto include some investments, say in Gallo Winery. That's in Modesto as well. It's got some reserves, which are confusingly called cash. That's actually a digital account of reserves held with the San Francisco Federal Reserve out there. Jolly Jester also has commercial bank accounts, sometimes confusingly called claims. In all commercial banks, Jolly Jester included, they have to have bank accounts at other commercial banks. This is brilliantly explained in Chapter 21 of Debt by Design by Joshua Marie, a friend of this channel, a very dear friend of this channel. And he lays out there's a very important technical reason the banks have to have bank accounts, but they all have commercial bank accounts at other banks. That's just the way things have to operate. But that is, those two, reserves and bank accounts, are both very liquid forms of assets. And then finally, banks have loans. These are simply IOU papers from the Jolly Jester's customers promising to pay basically a stream of payments back to the bank. Those are assets. On the liability side, the Jester itself owes some debt. Maybe it borrowed some money to buy its building, but it owes some creditors. Other liabilities include trading liabilities, in addition to Gallo stock, and also maybe it has some Thunderbird wine futures that went rancid. Nobody could have seen that coming, and now the Jester owes a bunch of money on those. It has some equity. This is different than the other liabilities. This is a good liability. This is the money that the Jester owes to its owners. It's like stock in the corporation. It is the good liability. It is the bank's cushion from basically from bankruptcy. It's a measure of how solvent the bank is. When it goes to zero, the FDIC will wind the bank down, at least in theory. Finally, we have what is true for a lot of banks, the biggest liability, and that is customer deposits. Deposits are liabilities because the customers, a lot of times these are called demand deposit accounts, because the customers can demand that the Jester or their bank cough up cash, which is something that the Federal Reserve prints, not the commercial banks. And that is what makes them liabilities. But they are liabilities, so it's a good thing if the liabilities leave the bank and go to another bank. Let's say they get transferred to the Cool Cat Bank there in Vietnam, Indiana. Another recurring character. I no longer live in Vietnam, Indiana. More on that later. But that's a good thing, right? The deposits leaving the bank, because now the bank's equity will grow and the owners will be richer. Isn't that great? No, that's not great, and that's not how things work. When deposits leave a bank, because they are a liability, they have to be matched by assets of equal value, or else the Cool Cat Bank is not going to take on liabilities like that without being compensated with corresponding assets. So in this case, the assets that would have to be sent over by Jolly Jester in order to have those deposits that transfer be affected, in order would probably be, you'd probably see reserves go over. So the Jester's account at the Fed would be drained. It would go over, followed by its bank account at Wells Fargo would probably go over. Normally, in a normal bank, in any normal bank, you would see the investments go over, like IBM stock. But the Jester invested in Gallo Winery, which is privately held, so the Jester is going to have to turn to loans, IOU papers. But those loans were made out at a lower interest rates, and now the interest rates are higher. Those loans are worth less, so they're going to take a haircut when they go over those loans. So they're going to shrink a little bit when they get transferred over, like so. And now you can see, I'm not going to do the animation, but the equity now is, it's real thin. The rest of it got wiped out. In practice, when deposits leave the bank like that, the equity gets totally wiped out and the bank gets shut down. And the equity is zero. But that's basically how things work there. The point here is that yes, deposits are liabilities, but they're paired with assets, which comes into play whenever there are transfers occurring, like the ones we just saw, meaning that banks need to be very mindful that deposits are a two-edged sword. So let's talk for a minute about how deposits are created in the first place, since they're so important in the banking system. So here we are back at the Jolly Jester Bank. There are two ways that bank deposits get expanded on the balance sheet. The first way is through loans on the bottom left. The Jolly Jester decides, hey, I want to make a loan. I want to expand my loan base here, and it decides to make a new loan. So a new customer or an existing customer signs new loan papers, and the loans get expanded. That's just a new asset that gets tacked on to the other assets on the bank's balance sheet. It's IOU paper. And when that happens, the customer who signs the loan gets his deposit account credited with the amount of the loan. And that is how the balance sheet grows. And that's how deposits grow in the very traditional way. Things have been done this way for several hundreds of years, predating computers by centuries, using paper instead of electronic accounting ledgers. So paper ledgers back in the day, now everything is done on electronic accounting ledgers on the computer. But that is the first very traditional way of expanding bank deposits. There's a second major way, though, to expand deposits, and that is for the Fed to buy assets from non-banks, which is what it did during the pandemic. And the way that works is, I've done a bunch of videos on it, but the Fed creates reserves out of thin air. It always does that. And it uses them to buy assets. Okay. But how does that work exactly? Because the buyer, in this case, the Fed, is a central bank, which isn't a commercial bank. And the seller is like a bank customer. It's not a bank at all. It's not a bank of any type. So how is it that commercial bank deposits get expanded when the Fed creates new reserves and buys asset from a non-bank? The answer is that transaction that I'm talking about, Fed to non-bank, is not possible without a commercial bank in the chain. The Fed can't directly buy an asset from any non-bank because non-banks don't have accounts at the Fed. Non-banks have accounts at commercial banks like the Jolly Jester, which in turn do have accounts at the Fed, and which are thus used as intermediaries in Fed to non-bank transactions. How does that work? Well, let's go back over to Jolly Jesterville here. And the way this works is, in this scenario we're looking at right now, the bank customer, the non-bank asset seller, has just transferred, say, a U.S. Treasury or a mortgage-backed security to the Fed, which now needs to pay the Jolly Jester bank customer. How does that happen? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is the Jester is going to credit the deposit account of the customer. That's the first thing. So let's just go ahead and do that. And then the next thing is the Fed is going to duke or credit the Jolly Jester here with more reserves. And so the reserves will expand like that. And so that's the second way reserves gets created. You have new deposits here, and the bank has new reserves here on the asset side of equal value. Let's say 3 here and 3 here, whatever that unit is. That's how bank deposits expand in the second scenario. And the Fed, by the way, admits that it does this. It admits this is the correct mechanical description of deposit expansion through asset purchases from non-banks, which you already know if you follow this channel. I did a video called Fed Admits the Crony Truth about pandemic QE, in which the Fed admits that is in fact how deposits expand when the Fed buys assets from non-banks. That's undisputed. And that's what the Fed did during the pandemic, and that Fed paper says as much. Both of those operations, though, traditional lending and asset purchases from non-banks, they both create new bank deposits. However, there is one very important difference you need to understand between the two. When the Jolly Jester issued that new loan, the Jolly Jester Bank, the bank officers, the board, whoever, the bank decided to do that. The Jolly Jester decided, yes, we want to expand our deposit base with a new loan, and that's what it does. With pandemic QE, by contrast, the Fed decided to expand Jolly Jester's deposits for it, and the bank had to go along basically as an instrumentality of the Fed. It had no say in the matter. Now, it might have agreed to keep its mouth shut about what it did, but that's another story. I don't know that one way or the other. I wonder, though, having watched some of the Silicon Valley Bank testimony, another bank testimony, it makes me wonder what went on there. But the mechanics of that procedure, undisputed. It's a matter of record. The point here is I want to emphasize this point because if you don't understand how pandemic QE worked, the purchase of assets from non-banks by the Fed, you are never, ever going to understand what this crisis is really about. And you're probably not ever going to understand where inflation came from. It came from the same place. We'll see that in the graphs in a minute. But if you do understand pandemic QE and the mechanics of it, this crisis where rich people's banks are the ones that are failing, suddenly begins to make sense because now you're clued in as to where deposits that are big enough to take down entire banks when they leave came from. They came from pandemic QE. 10 and 20 and $100 million bank deposits got created out of thin air when the Fed bought 10 and 20 and $100 million bonds from bank customers. Those whales simply did not exist before the pandemic in anything like the scale we are now seeing during this crisis. The record is absolutely indisputable on this point, and there is no better place to start looking at that record than with the bank of choice for California whales that kicked off this crisis, and that's Silicon Valley Bank. So let's go to the post-mortem in the Senate Banking Committee and see what we might discover here. Right here you see Senator Mark Warner. He is talking to FDIC Chairman Martin Gruenberg, who isn't shown. But let's listen to what Warner says here. His recitation of facts is very illuminating.
My understanding, 10 depositors alone had about $13 billion of deposits.
Okay, let's just cut that right there. Did you catch that? 10 depositors had $13 billion on deposit at Silicon Valley Bank. Right out of the gate, we have a problem. The deposit insurance limit, as you know, is $250,000. So far, just based on that, so far the story is this. 10 venture capitalists left billions of dollars with a B in the bank for 2 or 3 years, not only earning less interest than U.S. Treasuries would have gotten, which, people put their money, large-scale money, in U.S. Treasuries because it's the most liquid market in the world. That's why they go to Treasuries. They pay interest. So these venture capitalists left billions of dollars in the bank, not only earning less interest in U.S. Treasuries, but exposed to total loss at the same time for the privilege of earning less interest. Now, you might say, well, the Treasury could have a total loss too, but really, for that to happen, the U.S. government has to fail. And if the U.S. government fails, it's taking down every bank with it. It's taking down the whole kit and caboodle. The reverse is not true. A bank can fail without the government even noticing. The point is that the asymmetry in risk between bank accounts and U.S. bonds is glaring even before we notice that the bond pays interest and the bank doesn't. I wonder who these devil-may-care VCs are. You might think that their names, these bankers, these billionaires who pay money to risk their entire fortunes in alleyway dice games are confidential. Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it. But let's play that clip again, and let's let it run through. Warner offers a couple of nuggets that are worth discussing here.
My understanding, 10 depositors alone had about $13 billion of deposits. Again, it seems to me interest rate mismanagement is banking 101. And again, even at a $5 billion bank, this should have been called out. I also think the speed, I've often cited the fact that the largest bank failure we've seen was WAMU back in the crisis. $16 billion left that bank over a 10-day period. In this case, $42 billion, the equivalent of 25 cents on every deposit, went out in 6 hours. I'm not sure at that point what regulatory structure could have prevented that. And at least from reports, it seems to me that, and I say this as somebody who used to be in the VC industry, some of the very VCs who banked for a long time at SVB may have started this run and demanded all of their ancillary companies all go out at once.
Okay, let's start with $42 billion leaving Silicon Valley Bank in 6 hours. There's this notion I've seen going around that since 2008, we now have apps, and that's what enabled the exodus of money that he's talking about. I am here to tell you that that story is totally ridiculous. Number one, you don't need an app to move money out of an account in 6 hours. In 6 hours, you could walk to your branch and order the wire transfer in person. Number two, no one is casually transferring $1 billion out of their account on an app. They're doing what they did in 2008 and frankly in 1929. They're on the phone with someone in the C-suite of the bank, probably the president, saying, move my money out now or I'll break your legs, or worse. What makes today different from 2008 is not apps. That's ridiculous. That's just the media making up stories. In 6 hours, everything you can do with an app, you can do with a phone or in a car or on your feet and with a wire transfer. The difference today is not apps. The difference today is a number of people who have millions and even billions of money in their bank accounts, which add up to a killer whale bank run way faster now than back then. In 2008, you didn't have 10 people with $13 billion in their bank. You had $16 billion aggregated across so many thousands of accounts that it took 10 days for word to spread. More importantly, though, Warner gives up the entire game in this crisis by saying there were a few VCs who demanded that every one of their companies leave the bank at the same time. So this collapse, in other words, was ordered by a tiny handful of people with billions of dollars in their accounts. That couldn't happen in 2008, even with apps. The apps are simply a patsy in this crisis. The real question is, where did those whale accounts come from, and why do they exist in the first place? Since rational people, like I mentioned, they don't take needless risk for the purpose of losing interest payments and losing money. I must say, billionaires giving away their money by accepting low or zero interest payments from accounts exposed to total loss, that is the novel and defining feature of this crisis, and yet it goes totally unquestioned, both why people kept vast fortunes in bank accounts and where and when those accounts came from in the first place. So let's start with the origin of those accounts by going straight to the Fed database, FRED, the St. Louis Federal Reserve database, Federal Reserve economic data, and we'll look at some checkable deposit graphs, and we'll start with the top 0.1% of households in the U.S. So that's the top 1 in 1,000 households. And let's just look at the money here. So here we have the graph up. Get a good color, red. Okay. Here we have the graph up. And you can see the scale on the left here. It goes from 0 to 700,000. And that's millions. That's millions of dollars. So that doesn't really tell you much. What you really want to know is, how much the average household in the top 0.1% has in its checking account. By the way, this is also currency, but we'll get to this in a minute. The currency graph, if you look at Federal Reserve notes, it's like this. So the increase here, this is all checking accounts. You could just read this graph as checkable deposits. Currency is negligible, at least in the delta. Okay. But I want to point something out here really quickly in terms of the number of households. We want to know how many households are in the top 0.1%. But let me point out here that this is in millions, the units. So if we knew how many millions of households were in the top 0.1%, we could have their average account displayed directly on the y-axis. I'll get to that. But we need to know how many households there are. And I've got that in this other tab here. Total number of households is 131,000 million, so 131 million, meaning the top 0.1% is 0.1312 million households. Okay, that's a very valuable piece of information because now we can go back over to checkable deposits and we can modify the graph and we can divide by the number of millions divided by 0.1312. It's not going to change the shape of the graph, but it's going to change the scale. There we go. Okay. And now we're going to look at the average account, checking account of the top 0.1% household. Let me blow this up. Okay. Now look at this. Okay, let me make a note about timing here. This is the global financial crisis here. Okay, 2008, 2009. This is the onset of pandemic. Oh my God, I can't feel my legs. All right, the pandemic. I'm just going to go with the pandemic. This is the onset of the pandemic, and you could see the average checking account just explodes up for the top 0.1%. That's true of all wealth bands, but it's really true of the top 0.1%. But if you look at the numbers here, you can see now that the average account of the top 0.1% average checking account, $4.979 million. Let's just call that $5 million. Before the pandemic, in the first quarter of 2020, the average was 565,000. So 565,000 before the pandemic, $5 million after the pandemic. Okay, that's where the whale deposits came from, and that's when they came. It came during the pandemic, and I'm going to do something else with this graph. Let me get out of here. I'm going to just show you the correlation to the Fed's asset purchases, which I can get by total assets. Let's just add that. Hopefully we don't have to adjust it. Yeah, that's good. Perfect. Well, I mean to make one change though. Hold on. Let's adjust that to quarterly so everything is smooth. There we go. Okay. And now you can totally see the correlation between Fed asset purchases and checking accounts of the top 0.1% of checking accounts generally, really. We'll see that in a minute. Now, there are some people who will try to confuse this issue. They are legion, actually. And they say, oh, well, no, the red line, that's reserves, and reserves don't get into bank deposits, yada, yada, yada. Let me just short circuit that line of nonsense just by just cutting it out by going to adding a line of commercial bank deposits so that you can see that those reserves in red do show up in bank deposits. All right, there we go. It's in billions, so it's not going to show up, but we're going to add it. Okay. Let's make a couple changes, even though I can't see it. Change it to quarterly. Let's change the timing back to where it was, which was 2002, December 18. I don't know why it has to be that. It's quarterly. And now we need to edit that. We're going to multiply the commercial bank deposits, which are in billions, so they're crushed down. So we need to give them a kicker, get them into millions. And there you go. Okay. And they're quarterly? Yep. Okay. And so now you can see that when the Fed it made asset purchases in red, they go right into commercial banks and they go right into the top 0.1%. These are all commercial bank accounts. This is commercial bank accounts of the top 0.1% of households. Okay. And again, I did a video on how this worked, the mechanics of that. The Fed admits that its creation, its purchase of assets in red here created and caused new bank deposits. Yeah, I did a video. Again, it's called Fed Admits Crony Truth About Pandemic QE. It's the one I did the thumbnail of Charles Bukowski to all my friends.
To all my friends! Hey!
And that is where, by the way, the blue whale checking accounts come from. Like we heard from in the Silicon Valley Bank congressional record. But I want you to notice something here. This is interesting. look at this. The Fed it's timing. It's a timing issue. The Fed starts buying assets there, okay? And it shows up in the green line, in general commercial bank deposits right away, right? But the same isn't true of the top 0.1% of households, right? There's a delay before it starts kicking up. That delay is about that long. Whereas when the Fed started buying assets in red, there's an immediate increase in commercial bank deposits generally, but a delay with the top 0.1% of households. That's a very interesting thing. I didn't notice that for a long time until I was doing this video. Let me take a step back. When I was making all these videos about the Fed buying assets from non-bank, I kind of figured, I knew, the Fed was buying assets from non-bank financial institutions like BlackRock. Let me take another step back. Explain what households are. Households are one sector of several in the economy, but it's the one sector that includes people, meaning the other sectors include things like nonprofits, non-financial businesses, financial businesses that are banks, financial businesses that are non-banks, state government, local government, municipal government, so on and so forth. Those other sectors in the economy, they're really just legal entities only. They, as my legal history professor would say, they don't have eyes, they don't have a mouth. Households are not really legal entities. They're real living people. And households, they're counted differently. It's like 2.3 people per household or whatever it is. But my point is, they're people who have personal checking accounts, personal bank accounts, businesses and whatever. They don't have that. They have just sort of legal accounts. That green line we saw there, that's all bank deposits. That includes both households, people, and non-households, just the purely legal entities. It includes both of those alike. The businesses, the nonprofits, the municipal governments, and not. In other words, that green line there, it's kind of a mongrel. It's not parsed out. But the Fed does keep track, and we just saw it, at least on a quarterly basis, separately. It does keep track of checkable deposits just from households. And that's the blue line we saw, at least the top 0.1%. So when you go back over here and you see this big jump, this big pregnant bump that's coming from pandemic QE, the question is, what does that look like? What does that green line look like if you back out households, if you just subtracted out households, and you only had the legal entities there? In other words, the question I'm really asking there is, how much of pandemic QE was about boosting the bank accounts of businesses like BlackRock? And how much was about boosting the bank accounts of people and of households and of whales? And so I want to go over and take a look at that question. Okay, so what we want to see, in other words, is we want to see what the green line would look if it were just legal entities. In other words, you take households out. And we want to see the blue line, what it would look like if it's all checking accounts, all household accounts, not just the top 0.1%. So there's two problems with this graph. In other words, the green line includes household accounts, and all the other accounts. It includes everything, and we want household accounts out. And the blue line only includes the top 0.1%. So we want to change this graph to get those, to make these corrections, and then compare the two different lines, the non-household in green and the all households in blue. We want to compare that with the red. So let's make some changes to these graphs to get what we want. And I'm going to start with the blue. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I am going to edit the blue line. I'm going to actually delete the blue line, and we're going to start fresh. Yeah, remove it. There we go. I've got another tab over here that's all households. Okay, it's households generally, and they're checkable deposits. If you notice this code here, what I can do is just copy this code. Let me do that. Copy the code. Let me come back over here, and I want to add this graph. I want to add a line back. And now I want to paste the code. Yeah, there we go. Add that in. There we go. That's all households now. And then the other change we want to make, I want to back the households out of the green line. So let's go to the green line. Let me add a series, which is, again, it's on the clipboard. So it's adding in terms of it's adding it as a variable that I can play with. Right now, we've got A times 1,000, which we needed to adjust the magnitude. And what we want to do, the green line, we want to back out B, which is the households we just added. So minus B, apply. Okay, and look at that. Look at that. Isn't that interesting? So here, the red is the Fed buying assets. Okay, that's the Fed balance sheet increasing. Initially, it buys assets from institutions like BlackRock, financial institutions. But pretty quickly, that bump in legal entities, financial institution, it gets transferred to household accounts. There's a delay. That delay I showed you earlier with households account, here it is. In other words, financial institutions like BlackRock were kind of used as a pass-through to get asset purchases into into households. The commercial bank deposits, which increased for companies like BlackRock, it got passed on to households. When the Fed bought assets, in other words, most of the money went to legal entities right away, but it passed through to households. They're completely out of entities. I want to point out too, I know because I've done this channel for 8 years, I'm going to get a lot of the teachers' pets coming in saying, "Oh no, everything's okay. That's just the Paycheck Protection Program." No, it isn't. Look at this. Don't be an idiot. That's about 1.8 trillion, 1.9 up here. That okay. That's the middle of that. That's 5 trillion. Okay, that's a $3.2 trillion jump in household checking accounts. Paycheck Protection Program, that was about $800 billion, and that's assuming that none of it was paid back. Even if all of the $800 billion Paycheck Protection Program was went to the household accounts, it still fails to explain that jump. That jump is huge, and that's your inflation too. That's where your inflation's coming from. The conclusion here is that pandemic QE was 100% about inflating household accounts, individual checking accounts. It was not about really ultimately inflating non-household accounts. And actually, it was designed, I'll show you this in a minute, it was designed to produce whale accounts. And you can see that back over here in these graphs. I'm going to click over to another tab. Here you see checkable deposits in all 5 wealth bands. Let me blow this up. Okay. And the way the Fed divides it is 0.1%, top 1%, top 10%. So the top 10% of the country gets 3 bands. And the bottom 90% gets 2 bands. And the 2 bands are 50th to 90th, and then bottom half. And if you look at the amounts these bands increased, I'm going to kind of cheat here and use an overlay, and so we can compare before or after. For whatever reason, the after is only going to go to the first quarter of 2022. I don't know why the top 1% cuts off there, but it does, and that's fine. But let's freeze that there. That's the after, okay? And now let's look at the before. Let's freeze that there. And now you can see, okay, the effect of pandemic QE on the 5 different wealth bands. And as you can see, the smallest increase was the bottom 50% with the multiplier of their accounts. Okay, their accounts multiplied by 2.56. And the biggest increase was the top 0.1% with a multiplier of 7.77. And they went in order too, perfectly. Notice that. In other words, the higher the wealth band, the bigger the multiplier. Based on that, you can surmise that, the top 0.001% was materially larger than 7.77. Like, how much larger? 20 times, 100 times? Remember that the average account in the top 0.1% is 5 million. So now when you think back to that Silicon Valley Bank congressional record, $13 billion sitting in 10 accounts, that doesn't sound all that far-fetched now that you've seen these graphs. But for now, though, I want you to recall the official story of why the Fed made trillions of dollars of asset purchases to begin with, starting in March of 2020. This is the Fed press release from the Ides of March 2020, 5 p.m. The Federal Reserve is carefully monitoring credit markets and is prepared to use its full range of tools to support the flow of credit to households and businesses, and thereby to promote its maximum employment and price stability goals. That's what it said, price stability goals. You just saw that the minimum increase in checking accounts was 2.56 multiplier that went up to an 8 times multiplier. The Fed did that deliberately by purchasing assets from non-banks. Didn't buy assets from banks, bought them from non-banks. Okay? So the Fed lied when it said the asset purchases were done for price stability. You don't stabilize prices by multiplying everybody's bank account by 3.5 or 4 or 5 times. The Fed simply flat out lied when it said there was no inflation too, until it couldn't do that any longer without putting a paper bag over its head. It also lied when it said the inflation was transitory. It knew that was a lie. The Fed is just an institution that lies on behalf of its mega bank owners, its mega wealthy owners. You also saw that the wealthier the household, the bigger the multiple on the checking account. The Fed knows, in other words, the Fed knows damn well there are whales out there, and the Fed knows that because it bought the assets from those whales. It knows who they are. It bought assets from their businesses. And now those whales are swimming away from certain banks because of interest rate increases, supposedly. And guess who raised the interest rates? Yeah, it was the Fed. The Fed couldn't have controlled this crisis anymore if it had strings attached to the individual banks, which it pretty much does, as I just showed you as well. And remember, the whale bank accounts were maintained for years. Those asset purchases started in 2020, and the crisis started in March of 2023. Those accounts were maintained for years at risk of total loss, the complete loss, and they were losing interest payments the entire time because the bank pays a way less interest rate than a treasury pays. So the only real question here is why those accounts were maintained like that. Since they weren't maintained to make money, they lost money, in the form of lower interest payments compared to U.S. Treasuries. And these accounts weren't maintained for safety, since a bank account can suffer a total loss and a treasury can't. Why were those whale accounts left untouched for years if it wasn't to turn those accounts into killer whales when the time came? Now, I don't know that, obviously. I don't have that sort of insight in a bank. I'm not an insider. I don't know if that's what went on. But I tell you this much, that's a way better story, a way better explanation for this crisis than the mainstream story, which is totally ridiculous and which completely pretends that it's normal for people to keep billions of dollars in their checking accounts. Who keeps billions of dollars in their checking account anyway? Who maintains accounts that huge with that much risk? Can you think of anybody before this crisis started, who kept accounts that big? I can think of 2, and neither one is a good example. Example 1 comes from this book. This is J.P. Madoff by Helen Davis Chapman, who lost all of her money because she put it with Madoff. Let me just read from page 11 of her book. Bernie Madoff had an account at J.P. Morgan Chase. Madoff was leaving balances in his account of $3 billion to $5 billion, peaking at $5.6 billion in August of 2008. Okay, so that's the first example. The second example I can think of is from page 216 of a book I've recommended on this channel before, and that's U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency, self-published in 1912 by the real AOC, Alfred Owen Crozier. And Crozier talks about maintaining whale account too. And you got to remember, though, 1912, the dollar was way stronger back then, and there were way more banks back then. I think there were over 25,000 banks in 1912, meaning banks were smaller, and the dollar was way bigger back then. And on page 216, Crozier gives us an example of how a stranger rolls into town and he puts $200,000 into a bank, and he explains how easily the bank, a country bank he calls it, could be taken over by a then whale-sized deposit of $200,000 in that bank. The bank having deposits of $2 million and equity of $200,000. And here's what Crozier says: suppose now that the real object in depositing that $200,000 of cash in that bank was ultimately to acquire actual ownership of a majority of shares of the capital stock of that bank, meaning the equity, $101,000 equity position. How could the bank safely refuse to induce its stockholders to part with 51% of their stock holdings, even if the price offered was low, if the alternative was the possible sudden withdrawal of the $200,000 cash deposit and forced contraction of loans of $2 million and possibly the closing of the bank's doors? So there's your second example. Okay. So there you have it. One whale account existed because a criminal needed a place to stash billions of dollars that he told investors he was putting into the stock market, but wasn't. That was Madoff. And the other whale account was set up so that the whale could take over the bank. Whichever scenario you think more closely fits the pattern of the current crisis, it's not good. And by the way, for those of you teachers' pets out there who think the Fed is your friend and wonderful, because that's what Uncle Warren Buffett told you to think, please, I'd love for you to supply your own example, your own documented example of how whale accounts exist for the benefit of humankind in the comments. Could you do that? Awesome. In the meantime, I'm going to move away from the popular and totally brain-dead version of this crisis to more practical territory, which is this. Were there warning signs before February and March of this year that banks that ultimately failed were in potentially fatal trouble before they failed? Information, or there are signs that those banks are in trouble that you can now use and leverage to your advantage with your own bank? And the answer to that question is a big time glaring yes, as you are about to see. So let's go on over and check a couple of publicly available websites, and as we do some quick autopsy work, starting with Silicon Valley Bank. Okay, this here is part of, I'll drop a link in the description box for all these websites. But this is part of the FDIC website. Notice that the banks here, they loaded on this site in order of bank certificate number here in the left column. So in other words, these are all sortable. And what we want to do, the first thing we want to do to see how asinine it is to call this a regional banking crisis, let's sort on the total assets of the banks. Okay, we want it in descending order. Click again, and there we go. And there you go. That's pretty much what you would expect. The top four are exactly what you would expect, actually. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, and Wells Fargo from the global financial crisis. No changes there. But notice on down, if you just skip on down a little bit, you see the banks that have failed in this crisis. You see First Republic Bank at number 15, Silicon Valley Bank at number 17, and you scroll down a little farther, and you'll see Signature Bank right there. Signature Bank is at number 32, I believe. And you can see at the top here, to give you an idea of how big those banks are, there are 4,715 banks, meaning that the odds of a randomly selected bank being in the top 47 are less than a 1 in 100. All three of the banks that have failed are in the top 47. They're in the top 32. So that tells you right there that the odds that these banks randomly failed based on their size is less than 1 in a million. So right out of the gate, you know this bank crisis is about huge banks. That's 1 in a million is just impossible odds. This is not a regional banking crisis. It's a $100 billion. These banks here, look at this. There are 34 banks with assets over $100 billion. These banks are like the size of Greece or bigger. They're absolutely huge. This bank crisis is really about the too big to fail banks at the top here. Are just gobbling up the next rung down like a game of Pac-Man. That's what this crisis is about. But for now, let's get into the data on Silicon Valley Bank. The first thing I want you to notice about Silicon Valley Bank, well, a couple things. The certificate number. Okay, you always want to know a bank's certificate number. So when you go on this website and you search on your bank, and you can search your bank by name over here, just click that and get in there and search the bank name. Always take down the certificate number. That's the first piece of data to collect on your bank. The next thing to notice is the asset size of the bank, Silicon Valley Bank, $209 billion. Those are the first two pieces of data that you want to grab, and you want to copy them, and you want to put them into a spreadsheet, which I'll show you my own spreadsheet in a minute. But there are certain pieces of data that you absolutely want to collect on your bank so that you can make calculations that are critical to know about your bank in your spreadsheet. Now, in the last video, I told you there was a bank crisis shortly before Silicon Valley Bank failed, and I based that prediction on industry-wide panic borrowing from the Federal Home Loan Board. That was true for individual banks as a whole, and it is also true for individual banks, as you are about to see. And that's really the next major data point, piece of data you want to check on. So let's go back and let's grab Silicon Valley Bank here, and you just click these links, and the report you want assets, liabilities, and capital. Okay, the date's fine. That's our date, 12/31/22. Generate report. It'll come up quickly. There's our asset size. Again, take that down. You want to know that. But for now, what we want to know is FHLB borrowing. So to get to that, click on total liabilities and capital. Click on total liabilities. Go down the list here. Other borrowed funds. You also want to notice deposit. That's another thing you want to grab is deposit size. I'll show you what you want to grab in here when I go to my spreadsheet, the critical points, critical data points. Where was I? But you want to know other borrowed funds. Okay, click on that. Maturity and repricing of these funds. And look at this. Here you go. You have FHLB advances, Silicon Valley Bank. They divide them into two categories. Due less 1 year or less, and due 1 year to 3 years. Silicon Valley Bank, $15 billion due in less than a year. Its total equity is $15.5 billion. Basically, this bank, all of its equity was due to be paid back in under a year. This bank was in deep shit well before February and March of this year. And you can see that right from the FDIC data. It's staring you in the face right here. But you want to note both the 1 year and the 3 year short term, because any borrowing from the FHLB, that's a sign of trouble. Okay? So that's data point number one. And the same thing is true, those numbers, in terms of the percentage of equity that's owed to the FHLB short term. Same thing is true for Signature Bank and First Republic too. More than 75% of their equity was due to be eaten up by short-term FHLB loans. The question is, how bad is that? How does that compare with their peer group of other $100 billion banks? And to see that, let's take another look at banks listed in order of asset size, like we saw on the FDIC website. But now we're going to look at it in a spreadsheet. And so here I'm going to show you the spreadsheet I put together of the top 34 banks, which are basically every bank in the U.S. with more than $100 billion of assets is in this spreadsheet. And what you can see here is, again, you see the top 4 banks at the top by asset size. Let me just hone in on that. So you can see the banks are sorted by total assets here, like they were on the website. Okay. There's two reasons really you want to make a spreadsheet from this. One is so you can derive things like FHLB loans as a percentage of equity. In other words, on the FDIC website, they'll tell you the FHLB loans and advances, and they'll tell you the bank's equity, its amount of equity, but they won't tell you the percentage. You can do that yourself though in a spreadsheet. Okay, that's one reason to put things in a spreadsheet. The second reason to put things in a spreadsheet is you can add other data from other websites, maybe not the FDIC's website. You can put it into your spreadsheet and sort of customize things around the data that you think is important. For now, though, what we want to do is we want to sort the banks on FHLB as a percentage of equity, and so let's do that. And there you go. Look at the top banks here. Let me just highlight this for you. There you go. There are 3 dead banks right at the top: number 1, number 4, and number 6, with 141%, 97% Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic 78%. That's a very key indicator that these banks are in trouble. I will put this spreadsheet, and actually probably the underlying spreadsheet, which includes a lot of other work product in it, in a Substack post later. If you're interested in at least in the top 30 or 34 banks here, go to my Substack and sign up. But in any case, that is the first red flag test for troubled banks that you can check right on the FDIC's website. And really, you don't need a spreadsheet. You need a 4-function calculator. That's it. Like I said, big-time FHLB borrowing is a surefire indicator of a crisis, both industry-wide and for individual banks. And we just saw that. So red flag test number 1, big-time FHLB numbers, big-time trouble. Does my bank owe more than 50% of its equity to the FHLB in less than 3 years? We just saw 3 dead banks owed more than 75%. But that's actually not the biggest red flag test. The biggest red flag, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, is whale bank accounts. And yes, there is a decent way to test for whale-sized bank accounts using publicly available call reports. Put a link in the description box for it as well. So let's go on over and look at the website here. This website is part of the FFIEC. FFIEC. That is very cumbersome. It is a mongrel institution. It's part FDIC, part Fed, part NCUA, the credit union. Anyway, look at the link in the description box. This is the website, though. And what you want to do is you want to go down here and you want to pick call report. Okay? And this is why you remember you want to get your bank certificate number. For Silicon Valley Bank, recall the number was 24735. Enter. Okay. It's saying no results because I didn't choose the right date. Let's fix that. Okay. Let's generate the report. There you go. The report is generated. You can see this small window here. We don't need this anymore. We can cancel this. Cancel, damn you. All right. Now let's tab over to our report. Let's fill the window up with that guy. Let's zoom in to 113 is good. Let's go over to the table of contents. And what we are after in this report is Schedule RC-O. All the way, here you go. Okay. This is Silicon Valley Bank, 12/31/22. And you can see at the top here, let me zoom in a little bit, $175.5 billion in total deposits. But the interesting part is down here. Subsection B, deposits over $250,000, $157 billion. So you can see that a vast majority of Silicon Valley Bank deposits are whale accounts north of $250,000. They're uninsured, okay? You could also, if you're interested, and I am interested, I put this in my spreadsheet. This RCO form also reports the number of $250,000 accounts. You can see here Silicon Valley Bank, 37,466. So you can take the total number of those accounts, the total amount, and divide by the total number. And you can calculate, and you'll see this in my spreadsheet, that the average account at Silicon Valley Bank north of $250,000 was over $4 million. This is a rich person's bank, no doubt about that. And you can get that by straight division. Don't need a spreadsheet, just need a calculator. And I've done this for all of the $100 billion banks, all 34 of them. It's in column H of my spreadsheet. Let me go over that in a minute. But this is red flag test number 2. The percentage of total accounts over $250,000. That's in column E. Let me go back to our spreadsheet. Let me sort it on total assets, like we saw before. Notice right at the top, though, that you can see JP Morgan, the percentage of deposits over $250,000. JP Morgan is 42.4%. That is about dead center on the national average. But let's sort on this column. Let me sort on this column, percentage of deposits. And you can see there, look at that. Look at that. Let me highlight that. Our dead banks show up trifecta style in slots 1, 2, and 3. Percentage of deposits over 250,000, Signature Bank, number 1, 94%. Silicon Valley Bank, number 2, 89%. First Republic, number 3, at 80%. That is a big sign of trouble. And that's really what makes this crisis so twisted. You don't think of a crisis of like, well, rich people's banks failing. It should be poor people's banks failing, right? No, not at all. Column E here in the spreadsheet is the tell. This is a sign of big trouble. It's red flag test number 2. It's the most important test, is the percentage of deposits over $250,000. Now, the other thing you can notice here is that you have tens of thousands of these accounts, okay? So it doesn't take a PhD in mathematics to figure out what the third or fourth or fifth standard deviation looks like. Look at Silicon Valley Bank, where it's average here, average account size at Silicon Valley Bank, $4.184 million. These are huge accounts. And we know that this average, 4.184 for Silicon Valley Bank, that hidden inside that average were 10 whale accounts with $13 billion in them. So these averages with these numbers, there's a lot of whales swimming in these here waters. No question about that. Finally, I want you to look over here at the far right column, loans as a percentage of the bank's assets. Remember, we saw that loan papers as a percent of the bank's assets or on the bank's balance sheet as an asset. I bring this up because a lot of people will tell you that the crisis is really about banks that are lending out money at low interest rates, and now interest rates are higher, and it shows up, it's a big problem for loans. But yeah, that's a problem, and I actually raised it in that video, the last video. But you can see here that the numbers are all over the board. Of Silicon Valley Bank, only 35% of their assets were loans. It was way higher for First Republic. But can you really say that Silicon Valley Bank failed because it made too many low-interest loans when that was only 35% of their book? Are you kidding me? I mean, the people telling you that, they're right, but they're right to a very limited degree. They're missing the far bigger problem on the opposite side of the balance sheet. The number one problem being whale bank accounts, and the number two problem being panic borrowing from the FHLB. Look, it's not like making loans at low interest rates doesn't become a problem when rates go up. It does become a problem. I did a video on it. I explained what the problem is pretty much before any of these people did. But don't pretend that $13 billion sitting in 10 accounts isn't the real issue here. This crisis is being driven by a high concentration of liquidity on the liability side of the balance sheet, not by the asset side, which is a solvency issue. And as we saw, there is one and only one entity responsible for these massive liquidity concentrations among whales. And that entity is, yes, the Federal Reserve, which made these asset purchases, which bought trillions of dollars of assets from non-banks. So let's review what the Fed has done since the pandemic. It printed trillions of dollars of reserves, trillions and trillions of dollars of reserves. It created trillions of dollars of bank deposits in equal amounts of those reserves. It caused huge inflation. And now the whale accounts that it created, they're suddenly leaving certain banks and causing a crisis in which too big to fail banks like JP Morgan are getting even bigger, like I say, in a game of Pac-Man. That much, by the way, is all undisputed. It happened. It's all a matter of record. The question is why the Fed would be motivated to make too big to fail banks even bigger. And here I can only really speculate. So let me offer my 2 cents on that. There's really not a ton of evidence to back this up, but this is my best guess. A while back, I made a video called Your Federal Reserve Cancer RX is Ready for Pickup. And I showed in that video that the debt-based monetary system in the U.S. it's pretty much over. The productive class has been sucked dry by the parasites. And really the only hope left is to print the Fed to print its way out of the mess. That's what sovereign countries do when they borrow money from parasites instead of printing their own money. But that's where we are. And it's going to try to print its way out. The problem, though, when you try to do that, is you get inflation. So what the Fed needs, it needs a control system where a central entity like the Fed can delete money out of accounts. And CBDC would enable the Fed to do that. The problem is, though, and remember Sala Omarova, she was appointed for the SEC. She wrote a law review article advocating exactly that. Like, oh, you have inflation? No problem. just deleted out of people's accounts at the central bank. These proposals are out there floating around. Problem with a central bank digital currency, though, is that contemplates a one-tier financial system, or a one-tier monetary system. Our system is two tiers. So you have one tier at the top, that's the Fed, and you have the second tier, the commercial banks, the next rung down. In another video, which I called Larry and Carson's Excellent Pandemic, I explained the two-tier system in a diagram, and I show in a diagram how, through a series of diagrams really, how a two-tiered system gets reduced down to a one-tiered CBDC system. And the way that works is not hard to figure out. It's by eliminating the tier of commercial banks. And I think that's what's going on. But that's going to be a lot easier to do if you concentrate the banks, you get them into a few whales. And remember, it's early right now. The crisis only started in March. It reminds me a lot of 2008. Bear Stearns goes down in March, but the big boy, Lehman, that didn't go down until 6 months later in September. We're early on in this crisis. We're not done. Those whales are still out there. And like I say, though, that's only speculation as to the Fed's motivation. There's no way for me to know that. What's also speculation, right now at least, is the names of the whales who killed the three banks that are dead right now. At least it's a secret for now. In theory, okay, you could FOIA the Fed for the names of the people they bought assets from and see where those people bank or see where those entities bank. The problem is that if you FOIA the New York Fed for a list of entities they bought assets from, you know what you're going to get back? You're going to get back a list of 24 primary dealers. That's how the Fed, it's smart. It doesn't buy assets directly itself. It works through the primary dealers. So the New York Fed, which is a private entity, farms out the actual purchases of assets to 24 other private entities. And that way the Fed's got a double layer of secret protection. And it can game the money supply like it's been doing in total secrecy. In other words, the constitutional provision for coining money, that might be in the Constitution, and it is. It's in Article 1, but it's the Fed's private sandbox. And your eyes don't belong in the Fed's private sandbox, peon, so back off. That said, is there an entity that can get to the bottom of the crisis? Can someone get to the bottom of the crisis and find out what's really going on? Yeah, there is. It's Congress. The money coining provision of the Constitution appears in Article 1, like I said, the legislature. Congress created the Fed, and Congress can rein the Fed in. Congress could delete the Fed if it wanted to. The Fed might tell you it's independent of Congress. That's ridiculous. The Fed is a creature of Congress. Congress can do whatever it wants with the Fed. Congress could call the Fed in, get a list of entities that it bought assets from, starting with the biggest purchases, and then it could call in the FDIC. It could get a list of the biggest depositors who left the dead banks all at once. Then it could compare the list, find the commonalities between the two lists, and then subpoena the bank officers and the whales for every email, every text, every keystroke on every device they have, and they'd find out what's going on in no time. Congress could get to the bottom of this crisis and find out what's going on and why in 30 days. Is Congress going to do that? No, Congress is not going to do that. Congress is 100.0% corrupt. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing this to lay a record. So when all of this goes to shit, and it will, when it all goes to hell in a handbasket, thanks to the Fed and thanks to Congress, and people start picking up pitchforks and torches, they'll know where to go. We're getting near the end here, folks. I'm telling you, you're seeing that in the FDIC data on the whales, which are grotesquely huge thanks to the Federal Reserve. This is not going to end well for us. The crisis might appear to have died down, like I say, but it's early. Bear Stearns in March, Lehman in September. Remember that. Those whales are still out there. They can pull the plug whenever they want to. Now, as if this marathon episode of Best Evidence weren't already long enough for you, let me conclude by saying I finally, after 8 years of doing this and after 10 moves across the country, I have finally landed in a home and in a studio arrangement that is going to work for me long term. I am very happy here. If you would like to help this channel, you can send cash or check to me, John Titus, at, are you ready? Here's the address, 9660 Falls of the Neuse, Neuse Road, It's the name of a river I live near. Suite 138, number 241. That is in Raleigh, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27615. I have never monetized a video before. I have never asked for anyone to like a video. I've never asked anyone to subscribe. I can't stand that shit. And I got a pretty good inkling you're like me. So if you want to help out, and I wasn't for damn sure, I was never going to give YouTube a chance to screw me. So if you want to help out, it would be greatly appreciated. It really would. People have been asking lately. And anyway, that's how. Cash, check, money order. Silver and gold coins, awesome too. But in whatever the case is, not digital. We got to get away from that. We are not going to get a different outcome until we stop enslaving ourselves. Last thing, I wanted to touch on bailouts and why there really were bailouts. These people with accounts north of 250,000 getting bailout. That's worth a whole different a whole different video. The people who tell you that's not a bailout are they're flat wrong about that. It's so idiotic though. I didn't want to extend this video anymore with it. Just ridiculous. But I'll get to that when I get to that. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.